Welcome, thank you, welcome to a bit fierce and violent, but welcome to this forum with Liz Carmichael, the Reverend Dr. Liz Carmichael from Oxford, who's going to talk about the National Peace Accord in South Africa, which was the arrangements which lasted stood between the time when Mandela came out of prison and the time of the elections, and went on briefly after that. But she will talk about that. But let me talk about Liz. We've known Liz now since the 70s. We first met in Johannesburg in 1979 when she was working as an anaesthetist in Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto, and she could describe at length what happened on a Saturday night in Soweto. She was just talking to us about people, putting their fingers in people's hearts when they'd been stabbed while they went down to the operating theatre. But it was you saw the impact of apartheid on people's lives at that point, and that was part of the story. Liz then went back to England and trained as a theologian, and did a DPhil in Oxford, Friendship, which it was published later in 2004, Friendship, Interpreting Christian Love. And then, at the encouragement of Desmond Tutu, went back to South Africa in 1991. Yes. Yeah, and was one of the first women, among the first batch of women to be ordained, is that right?
Yes, there were 7 of us in 1992, I was
Yeah, to be ordained as a woman in South Africa, and was working in the Diocese of Johannesburg in education and spirituality when she became, and I hope she will tell us the story in a little more detail, when she found herself the chair of the interim crisis committee, I think it was the local peace committee in Alexandra Township, which she kindly took Nana and me around 1992 when there was a little war going on, but we were very safe and happy. But there's some good pictures in her book, which is at the back. And if you want to buy the book, and you have a checkbook or cash, that you can buy it at the back after the talk. So she worked there till 1996. She returned to Oxford as chaplain at St. John's College, Oxford. And where she was till her retirement. Presently she is, I have to get all this right, Emeritus Research Fellow of St. John's College, Oxford. She is also the director of the Theosevia Centre for Christian Spirituality and convenes the Oxford Network of Peace Studies. So amazing wide range of experience, which I will now ask her to tell us about, specifically in relation to the National Peace Accord. Liz, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, John, and thanks to Oliver and Kelvin and to all of you for arranging this forum this morning in this beautiful place. It's my first visit. So I'm going to talk about South Africa, about how South Africa got into the particular position it was in when the transition, the big transition from apartheid to democracy happened, which was in the 1990s, and specifically about the National Peace Accord. Are we okay with sound? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Can you all hear me clearly now? Good. So The one thing that everybody has heard of as a transitional structure was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Desmond Tutu just after he retired from being Archbishop of Cape Town. What people don't often realize is how much happened before that. And the National Peace Accord was the first of the transitional instruments. So that is what I'm going to talk about. And it was signed in 1991. It operated until after the election in 1994. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just to put things in perspective, was organized after the 1994 election and operated from 96 to 98. So the National Peace Accord was of historical importance for at least 3 reasons. It was the very first consensus agreement on a fully multiracial and multi-party basis in South African history. Its signing in September 1991 opened the way for the beginning of the constitutional talks, which opened on the 20th of December 1991, and which devised the constitution, the interim constitution, under which the 1994 election could be held. And thirdly, the National Peace Accord was, unlike previous peace agreements, there had been 1 or 2 in South Africa, in that it set up serious peace structures to implement itself. A full infrastructure for peace, of peace committees at national and regional and local levels, which held together and grew more strongly and mobilized the whole country for peace during that critical period of 1991 to 94. And this was despite the fact that in the constitutional talks there were breakdowns and boycotts, but that didn't affect the peace structures. So they were able to build new understandings and relationships and to prevent much violence and to mobilize the whole country behind the idea of peace. They gave the country a safety net throughout that period. So I'd like to talk a bit about who the people of South Africa are, because they are remarkably varied. When Nelson Mandela was formally elected as president, which was in Cape Town.
Just going to fix this just a bit more.
Righto.
Let's try that.
In Cape Town on the 9th of May 1994. Can you still hear? Good. That was the day before his great inauguration in Pretoria, which you might remember seeing on TV. So in Cape Town, he spoke quite lyrically of these are his words, the fateful convergence of the peoples of Africa, Europe, and Asia on these shores. Another way of saying it is Archbishop Tutu's, "We are the rainbow people of God," which he coined in 1989. In that convergence lay the seeds of potential cohesion and a rainbow nation, and the seeds of potential conflict. Southern Africa has a very long record of human habitation. It has a rich fossil record and an archaeological record of groups of cave dwellers, both along the coast and in the interior, the high plains of the interior. The first people of whom we have more knowledge and who are around today still are the Khoisan, or Bushmen, hunter-gatherers who ranged across southern Africa for at least 50,000 years, leaving their rock art on the overhangs and the clicks, which they have bequeathed to several vernacular languages. Then, around 2,000 years ago, various groups of Bantu people, and Bantu simply means people, different tribal groups with different languages, who were cattle-owning farmers, migrated southwards from Central Africa and settled in the high interior and down the eastern coast by the warm Indian Ocean, in what became KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. The Western Cape, meanwhile, developed a population of Khoi pastoralists who had cattle but were related to the San. And then white Europeans first set foot on southern Africa, as far as we know, in 1488. And that was the Portuguese expedition of Bartholomew Dias, seeking a new trade route to the Spice Islands of Indonesia. He rounded the Cape and made landfall in Mossel Bay on the south coast in 1488. White settlement only began nearly 2 centuries later, in 1652, when the Dutch East India Company established a vegetable garden under Table Mountain to supply its ships going to Indonesia. The Dutch were joined quickly by Huguenot refugees and German farmers, all Calvinists, eventually creating the people called Afrikaners, literally Africans. They imported a large slave population from Angola and from Indonesia and all around the Indian Ocean. And the mixing of all these races, white and black, created the coloured people, who still live mainly in the Cape, then numbering about 3.5 million, and today some 4 million. Then in 1795, when Britain was fighting France already, before the Napoleonic Wars, the British temporarily took over the Cape to prevent the French from doing so. British rule was permanently established in the Cape in 1814. And that brought large-scale missionary activity, particularly from Anglicans, Methodists, Catholics, and Presbyterians. You've heard of great Scottish missionaries. Andrew Murray worked with the Dutch Reformed Church, Robert Moffat, David Livingstone, and so on. The British brought in English colonists who were very ordinary people with no pioneering skills, and they were landed in the Eastern Cape in 1820 and in the years after. They moved northwards, clashing with the Xhosas in a series of frontier wars. Xhosa leaders were the first political prisoners to be sent to Robben Island off Cape Town. And meanwhile, further north, King Shaka of the Zulu clan, who died in 1828, was subjugating many other clans around him and forming the Zulu kingdom. He trained its young men rigorously as warriors, practiced a scorched earth policy to keep enemies at a distance, and created a fearsome image of Zulus as a warlike race. And the Zulus became, and still are, the largest tribe. The Cape Colony had a liberal British-style constitution, which meant it had a qualified franchise that gave the vote to all free males of all races, people who qualified in terms of education and property ownership. And in 1834, slavery was ended throughout the British Empire, including South Africa. At that point, many Afrikaner farmers, Boers, who did not take kindly to British liberalism and British rule, packed up their wagons and, during the 1830s, set off northwards in a series of treks in search of land and freedom. On the way, they encountered the Zulus, and after an episode when their leaders were actually killed by the Zulu king, the successor of Shaka, in 1838. Towards the end of that year, they defeated the Zulus at the Battle of Blood River, where they learned the value of forming a defensive wagon circle, or in Afrikaans, a lager. And before the battle, they made a vow that if God gave them victory, they would keep that day, the 16th of December, as an annual remembrance. And the whole event gave the Afrikaners a national identity as a race favoured by God, a race like ancient Israel, who believed that God was giving them this land. The trekkers moved up onto the high grassland of the interior and established two independent republics, the South African or Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State. And the franchise in those republics was whites only. Down in Natal, a British trading post was created in 1824 by permission of King Shaka at what is now Durban. It expanded and became the British colony of Natal, and Zululand remained independent until 1879, when, first of all, a small expeditionary force met disaster at Isandlwana. You may remember the film Zulu. And then a much bigger force later that year took the Zulu capital, and Zululand was absorbed into Natal. By now, people were also arriving from India. Starting in 1860, the British brought indentured labourers from India to work in the Natal sugar plantations, and Indian settlers, richer so-called passenger Indians, followed them and started setting up businesses. And it was among the Indians that Mahatma Gandhi worked for 21 years, 1893 to 1914, defending their rights as British citizens. He never sought to work with the black African people, but he developed there his strategy of nonviolent resistance. By now, diamonds and gold are being discovered, and that mineral wealth and desire for it, combined with the European scramble for Africa, on the basis that if we didn't grab a piece of land, somebody else would, and the imperial ambitions of Cecil Rhodes to paint Africa pink from Cape to Cairo, all of that culminated in the Second Boer War of 1899 to 1902, in many ways the first modern war with machine guns and barbed wire and so on. The Afrikaners fought in fast-moving mounted groups, commandos, and the British sought to destroy their support base by destroying farms and ordering the wives, children and servants into concentration camps, where some 27,000 died, mainly of disease. And Afrikaner dislike and resentment of the British became deep and visceral. After the war, a national convention met in 1908-9 to draw up the constitution of the new united country. The prime concern of the British was to reconcile with the Afrikaners. And despite many liberal protests from both blacks and whites, no black representatives took part. The population then was about 6 million, of whom 1 million were white. South Africa emerged in 1910 as a union of 4 provinces based on the previous colonies, the Cape, Natal, Transvaal and Free State, with the status of a self-governing dominion within the British Empire, the same status as Australia, Canada, New Zealand. In response, black leaders formed the South African National Native Congress, later named the ANC, in 1912. It was loyal to the Crown and put up a very gentlemanly resistance against the terrifying Land Act of 1913, which reserved almost all the land for white ownership, and the erosion of what other rights were left. Afrikaner nationalists, meanwhile, formed the National Party in 1918, and in 1915, and in 1948, that nationalist party became the government, coming to power on a manifesto of apartheid, literally separateness, a political philosophy that had been developed during the fascist period of the 1930s. It came to power on a minority of white votes, but with a majority of 5 constituencies in Parliament. Apartheid fractured the country into separate racial and tribal groups, determining where each person could live and work. Grand apartheid meant setting up some 10 tribal self-governing territories or homelands, derogatively called Bantustans, which removed South African citizenship at a stroke in 1970 from all black Africans, expecting each one to become a citizen of their appropriate Bantustan. Just 4 of the Bantustans took independence from Pretoria, which didn't mean a great deal. They were not recognized by any other country, but they did acquire armies, and therefore they could have military coups and diplomatic representation in Pretoria. So they were a problem in various ways during the reintegration period of the transition. South Africa became a pariah state, condemned and sanctioned by international bodies. The ANC then acquired new young leaders in this apartheid period, including Oliver Tambo, who was president of the ANC and was sent into exile to carry on, and Nelson Mandela, who formed the armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe. The 1950s saw strong multiracial, non-violent resistance in the Defiance Campaign and the formulation of the Freedom Charter, a short document just saying we want a truly free, multiracial South Africa in 1955, which became the manifesto of the ANC. It was after the shooting of 69 unarmed protesters by police in Sharpeville Township in 1960 that armed resistance began. And at the same time, South Africa became a republic on 52% of the white vote and dropped out of the Commonwealth. After 1976, when the youth of Soweto rose up against their inferior education, which was going to be made more inferior by an arbitrary ruling that maths and other important subjects must now be taught in Afrikaans. After that uprising in 76, there was an almost constant state of violence and states of emergency. During the 1980s, there was a partial rolling back of the grand apartheid policy under P.W. Botha. South African citizenship was restored to black African people. The group areas, the pass laws were abolished. But this was a time of reform and repression and lots of dirty tricks. So it was not a period when really the transition could begin. In the book that I've just written, I have sketched the history of separation, but I've also laid emphasis on the resistance against it, coming from different races, and the vision of equality and unity that was kept alive by black and white liberal leaders. And I think something about hope and optimism that came up in the sermon today. It's interesting to think of hope as aligning yourself with the values of the kingdom. And that's what many people did in apartheid South Africa, and it's what attracted me to go and work there. And Christian, Jewish, and communist people all kept that hope alive. And in the 1980s, secret talks took place, both internally between Mandela, who was in prison He had been moved off Robben Island and was now in Pollsmoor near Cape Town. And externally, particularly the talks which were funded by Consolidated Goldfields, based in London, and which brought the ANC in exile under Oliver Tambo and Thabo Mbeki into talks with Afrikaner opinion formers, not members of the government themselves, but people who knew the members of the government and were in contact, in fact, with P.W. Botha and then F.W. de Klerk. And it was those talks and the fact that apartheid was patently not going to work that brought F.W. de Klerk, the new state president, to announce at his first state opening of Parliament on the 2nd of February 1990 that he was unbanning the liberation movements and unconditionally releasing Nelson Mandela. At that moment in history, broadly speaking, two major conflicts existed in South Africa. One was the overall conflict affecting the whole country, pitting the majority of the population against what was still an apartheid government and its security forces, primarily the police force in its several varieties, which had been the enforcers of apartheid and were cordially hated, and the insidious security branch with its dirty tricks unit and military intelligence with its own dirty tricks unit. And the second conflict related to the first was a specific grassroots war between ANC supporters under the banner internally of the United Democratic Front, which was mainly non-violent but also had slipped into violence in Natal, and the supporters of the conservative Zulu Inkatha movement, headed by Chief Buthelezi. And that had raged among the Zulus. It was an intra-Zulu thing, first of all, since the mid-1980s in KwaZulu-Natal. So the release of Mandela brought two expectations. One was that multi-party talks would soon begin to devise the new constitution and prepare for the first democratic election. The other was that Mandela would meet Buthelezi, they knew each other from the past, and the ANC Inkatha violence would abate. But neither expectation was fulfilled. The only talks were an agonizingly slow series of ANC government bilaterals focusing on security matters. And the ANC's hawks prevented Mandela from meeting Buthelezi because that would give him a recognition which the hawks did not wish to give. Instead, in July 1990, that violence spread up to the townships around Johannesburg and the Vaal, the industrial heartland of South Africa. That was when Inkatha became a political party, the Inkatha Freedom Party, and began recruiting, intimidating and violently recruiting in the reef townships and hostels, these huge hostels built for single people who were allowed into the white urban areas under apartheid as workers. And many of the hostels were a majority Zulu, and at this point, the others who were not Zulu or not prepared to align with Inkatha were violently chased out, often pitting the hostels as fortresses against the townships as generally ANC supporting. So a crisis point was reached in May of 1991 when the ANC threatened to pull out of all talks. And at this point, a remarkable group of facilitators appeared. They came from business, which had set up a common organization called the Consultative Business Movement to play a progressive role in the coming transition. It involved all the big business houses like Anglo-American and the Barlow-Rand conglomerate, and at that stage about 40 others, and it grew to more than 100 businesses. So the consultative business movement provided people willing to serve as facilitators in the political process. And the churches had managed to come together in 1990 at a conference at Rustenburg, which for the first time since 1960 managed to draw together leaders of the Dutch Reformed Church right across to the black-led churches, with all the English churches of the South African Council of Churches, which had led the visible resistance in the country in the middle, and the charismatics as well. Everybody who mattered from the church scene was there at Rustenburg. And the Dutch Reformed Church, following the lead of its black branches and of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, had just managed to declare apartheid a sin. So there was a reconciliation among the churches, and they set up the Rustenburg Committee, which had the same objective as the consultative business movement, to play a progressive role in the transition. So 12 facilitators came together, 7 church people, including Tutu, and 5 from business. And they offered themselves as facilitators in this impasse in the political situation, where de Klerk had imagined he would be able to convene everybody, but the ANC did not wish to be convened by de Klerk, and the IFP was very wary of being convened by anybody. And on 22nd of June 1991, it's a long story how they got themselves accepted, but jumping that, they did get themselves accepted, and they got all the politicians, except the far right, together on the 22nd of June 1991 to agree to negotiate peace agreements to be signed as soon as possible by the top leaders. On the 22nd of June, the parties had been asked to send workers, lieutenants, as it was put, not the top-level leaders, but the people who would do the work of negotiating peace agreements and referring back to their principles and so on. So that went on, involving 4 working groups and a coordinating group for the next 3.5 months. And the National Peace Accord was the result. It was signed by 29 organizations on the 14th of September 1991, and this is the National Peace Accord. It's a little booklet in its printed form of 33 pages, 10 chapters. And it starts with the declaration that the establishment of a multi-party democracy in South Africa is our common goal. That's the first time that people of the whole spectrum in South Africa could state that together. And it contains, for example, Chapter 2, the Code of Conduct for Political Parties and Organizations. That begins with a short preamble about the importance of political parties in a democratic system. Then it goes on to these undertakings, and from these undertakings you can tell what people had actually been doing. No political party or organization or any official or representative of any such party shall kill, injure, apply violence to, intimidate, or threaten any other person in connection with that person's political beliefs, words, writings, or actions. remove, disfigure, destroy, plagiarize, or otherwise misrepresent any symbol or other material of any other political party or organization. Interfere with, obstruct, or threaten any other person or group traveling to or from or intending to attend any gathering for political purposes, or seek to compel by force anyone to be a member, and so on. And then some very important little clauses towards the end of this short but absolutely seminal code. An undertaking to ensure that the appropriate authorities are properly informed of the date, place, duration, and routing of any public march, rally, etc., and to take into account and to communicate with other parties and the community. That gave the opening for a new kind of peace monitoring, which was the enforcement of the accord by consensus through preliminary meetings organised by the peace committees before any major event, and sometimes it was very major, like the funeral of Chris Hani, who was assassinated in 1993. And then, during the event, there would be peace monitors on the ground with radios, in contact with the Joint Operations Control Centre. They would be in touch with party leaders and with the security forces, and everyone would coordinate to make sure that this event went smoothly without violence. And literally thousands of events were monitored in that way. And then, going on in the peace accord, there are many undertakings by the police, from simple ones: wear your name on your uniform, paint numbers on your vehicles, to more complicated investigative units and so on. And this was all moving the police from their very militaristic style previously into community policing and the philosophy of community policing. And they were genuinely aiming to do that, to transform themselves. And for the time being, they managed it extremely well. There have been some backslipping after that. And then there are other security matters and a code of conduct for the police, and then some measures to facilitate socioeconomic reconstruction and development. And that was a story that began very well under the peace structures, but sadly ran into the sand afterwards, and South Africa is still suffering from that failure. And then the peace structures themselves, the Commission of Inquiry into Public Violence and Intimidation, which was adopted into the peace structures in order to come into being. Then a National Peace Secretariat, under which the government would fund peace structures at regional and local levels, and a National Peace Committee to preside over the whole thing, and measures to enforce the peace agreement when the inevitable complaints of breaches began to come in, and that was dealt with by a committee of lawyers under the National Peace Committee, and it was essentially dealt with by publicly shaming and naming. And that worked. By 1993, Mandela and Buthelezi were beginning to admit that everybody was responsible for the violence. It wasn't just you, other people. So those are the basic contents of the National Peace Accord. The peace structures were then set up. The National Peace Committee of political representatives, and it immediately set up subcommittees for publicity, marketing the idea of peace, and for socioeconomic reconstruction and development. The National Peace Secretariat set up 11 regional committees and a training committee to train the committees. And each region could set up as many local peace committees as it reckoned were necessary. The Goldstone Commission got going, and there was also a police board which helped to transform the police. A little illustration of what this meant on the ground in Alexandra Township. Alexandra had fallen into chaos with a battle going on between the two very large men's hostels, which had become Zulu fortresses, and the rest of the township. The ANC line was that these buildings should either be demolished or turned into family units immediately. The IFP argued that Zulus needed these places in order to have work in town, and that was a real argument. And each side felt that it was being attacked by the other, and each side thought that the police were helping the other. So the problem was tackled, but first of all, by an interim crisis committee, which was parachuted in from an emergency meeting on Alex under the regional peace committee, which had just been formed. And this was April of 1992. And we had on that tiny committee representatives of the ANC, the IFP, the Moderate Democratic Party, relief organisations and churches, and with lots of lines into the community. So we agreed to meet every day and to monitor what was happening, to find out who was killing who and why. And we basically found that it was a matter of defence of these no-go areas which had been created, the hostels and the township outside, and perfect strangers could be killed for straying into the wrong place. If they weren't recognised, they were killed. So we began to get a handle on this, and after another 2 or 3 pretty violent months, by September, calm was beginning to come down on Alex. And by Christmas, we really had a much calmer situation. And throughout 1993, we were able to build up the idea of peace, to train 200 people in Alex and 50 from the surrounding suburbs as peace monitors to act in Alex. And we got voter education going in view of the coming election and so on. During 1993, there was a big national campaign for peace, and it was at that point that a logo was invented, which was immensely important. You need a song. We'd got a song by then. And you need a logo around which everyone can gather. And that's the Peace Dove logo, which became the symbol of peace. Everybody wanted the T-shirt. I'll show you that in a moment. And just stick this in place. And it became, of course, the symbol of the peace structures itself. Okay. It took 5 months for the top advertising company to develop this logo with focus groups and what have you. So the idea of peace was catching on, and you could have little plastic buttons, you could have the basic T-shirt, and literally millions were distributed, and everybody wanted the T-shirt. You could have a T-shirt with the words of the peace song, South Africa, we love you. Let's show the whole world we can bring peace in our land. So that's Peace Doves and the Peace Song. And then for New Year 1994, which was going to be the election year, the whole year was declared a year of peace, and the textile workers, in their unpaid overtime, agreed to make 1 million new T-shirts for New Year in this design, with lots of little doves coming in to join the peace doves. Those went on sale on the 12th of December in all the major supermarkets and clothing shops, and they sold out in 3 days. 1 million. And more were made. More were made later on. So in Alexandria, for example, there's mass action by the ANC in '92, and a Methodist bishop from the regional committee and I spent that day commuting between that huge march and the IFP hostels, just making sure that everybody knew what was happening and that nobody got frightened or started shooting preemptively, thinking that there was going to be an attack. There was not going to be an attack on the hostels, and we went through the whole day peacefully, something that might well not have happened before. So the publicity campaign was immensely important, and by the end of '93, you couldn't do anything without doing it for peace. If you were doing knitting, you had to do knitting for peace. If you were doing yachting, it was yachting for peace. And running, everybody was running for peace. The Soweto Marathon happened for peace, and the prizes were given out by Miss South Africa, who had dedicated her year to peace. And the other thing, monitoring, I've mentioned, and these were the bulletproof vests of the peace monitors. We trained 20,161 peace monitors and fielded 18,500 over the election. Together with international observers who in '92 came to work with the peace committees from the UN, the Commonwealth, European Union, and Organization of African Unity. We had a peace day on the 2nd of September 1993, when all the radio stations at noon held a minute's silence and then played the peace song, which took about 4 minutes, and everyone was invited to come out of their offices and homes and hold hands in the street. And that's a day that many people remember. And all sorts of things happened for peace that day as well. So, over the election, as I've said, 18,500 peace monitors were deployed. The whole atmosphere of the country had been altered. There was trepidation up to a week before the election because the IFP was not taking part, and IFP people were pretty nervous about coming to peace meetings, but we were in contact with them. We got radios in the hostels, and we knew that things were calm inside and so on. And a week before the election, an agreement was made involving a remarkable Nigerian freelance mediator who was brought in by the churches. So what next? After the 1994 election, the peace committees had still things to do, peace building, and particularly getting into community development right down at the grassroots. And we'd begun to do that, and there are some quite striking projects which had been initiated or completed. There was much more to do. But the Government of National Unity, in particular led by Thabo Mbeki, who was Deputy President, reckoned that peace had now been achieved. We didn't need peace committees any longer, so they were not funded beyond Christmas of 1994. And many people now think that was a bit of a mistake. But there you are. There's a taster of the National Peace Accord and its importance. You've got, I think you've been handed out a list of naughty things that people were doing made by the ANC. I can assure you that the IFP was drawing up equal lists on the other side. And the peace committees were going around finding out what the facts were and disseminating them in the community and, if necessary, calling a meeting to sort it all out. Because rumours flew, and we had to do a lot of rumour control and allegation control. So there you are.
Thank you very much. There we go. We have time for just a few questions. Liz, is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, if you just put up your hand, I'll come around if those of you would like to ask Liz anything. Yes, Dominic.
Thanks, Oliver, and thanks, Liz. Wonderful context. And I'm over here, Liz, if you're wondering where I am. And I think it's very clear from what you said how foundational the National Peace Accord was to kind of democratic development and the eventual peace which came about. In terms of the direction of concessions, because you might think the government is in a very powerful position, and I'm just wondering, on both sides, what were the concessions? What were the main concessions made, and what convinced them to make those concessions?
Okay, question, what concessions were made? Remarkably few that people didn't want to make. For example, all the agreements about how the police would behave. The de Klerk was fully behind that. There were two intractable issues. One of them was the carrying of traditional weapons, which the IFP saw as a badge of honour. You couldn't be a proper Zulu if you didn't go around with your shield, your sticks, some of them sharpened, your spear, and your club, your knobkerrie. So all of those were traditional, and the IFP had formed a habit, quite a recent habit, of carrying them on marches, funerals, to rallies and so on. So that was kind of finessed in the final document, and it was left to another government proclamation to be made in consultation with the parties, which actually said exactly the same as previous proclamations. So that could be managed. From this time on, you didn't really have the kind of rampages that you had before, which did involve both guns and traditional weapons. And by the way, the ANC carried traditional weapons when it felt like it too. In fact, they're carrying them on the cover of this book. This is an ANC march being monitored. The other intractable issue was the existence of private armies, and each side slung accusations at each other about their private armies. To the ANC, the KwaZulu police were a private army run by Buthelezi, who was Minister of Police, and to the IFP, and indeed the government, the ANC's Umkhonto weSizwe was a private army. To the ANC, it was the National Army. So each stayed with their perceptions, and the wording was finessed. Self-defense units were all supposed to become neighbourhood watches, working with the police, and none of them did. But then, by then, they weren't really operating in most places, so it didn't matter greatly. I hope that sort of answers your question.
Thank you. Yes.
First of all, I think I should confess that I was the one who drew up the report that is being circulated, and I was there from April and part of May in '94, working for the African National Congress, and it was terrifying. And it's as simple as that. There were bombs, there were threats of bombs, there were shootings, assassinations, and we did not feel in the least bit safe. The thing that really made me feel unsafe was that the police who were guarding the ANC offices in Jeppe Street had swastikas on their helmets. So it's just to give you an idea of what it was like. But the thing that really struck me was that prior to the opening of the polls, there was a lot of violence. After the opening of the polls, it was to do with electoral fraud, basically presiding officers, presumably on all sides, but I only had the ones reported to me who were actually acting against the ANC, but they were actually stealing ballot boxes and hiding them in the toilets. They were telling people that they couldn't vote at a polling station if they weren't voting for particular parties. And the question really is, how did we get from that confrontation to reconciliation? Because that's what happened once the voting had taken place and the votes had been counted. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
Well, the parties, although everybody knew that there had been fiddling at the margins at least, the parties agreed on the result, and their supporters accepted that, with the exception that violence did continue in KwaZulu-Natal, and the peace agreement between the IFP and ANC was only signed in 1999 in KwaZulu-Natal in preparation for the next election, 5 years after '94. So I think that the main answer is the parties accepted it. And yes, there are all sorts of stories, and the peace structures had a lot to do with making sure that ballot boxes did get to the right place and were not opened before they were supposed to be opened, and so on. Yeah.
Thank you. There's time for one final question.
Thanks very much, and I hope I'm not preempting anyone else's question at this point. Many, many thanks indeed for your presentation and the illumination in it about this part of the story. It was so good to hear. The description of apartheid has been applied in recent times and accepted by a number of human rights organizations about the situation in Israel-Palestine. And I wonder if you can say anything about how even some parts of the process that you've described to us today might be applied. It's a different situation, of course, but there are similarities. And there's certainly, I believe, lessons to be learned from the National Peace Accord and so on. We've been thinking about hope today, and I just wonder if there's any hope that we might see in that situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think with regard to the Middle East, to Israel-Palestine, one can only regret that opportunities have been missed. In the time of Rabin, before he was assassinated, at the time of the Oslo Accords, if they had been set up much better with implementation structures that worked, and they did not have those. And it all happened at the same time as we were working on the peace committees. And we looked at TV and we thought, that's not going to work because you don't have the structures that are going to make it work. And at the time of the peace accord, the major parties in South Africa all wanted to go ahead to a multiracial South Africa. Well, an opportunity was missed. That's all I can say at the moment, I think.
Thank you very much. I'm going to draw this to a close and echo what I've heard from others as they've asked questions. Clarity, Liz. You spoke with such clarity today, and that is such a gift. Gift to us, and I thank you very much for that, for sharing your knowledge, for sharing some memorabilia of this event. And what's last to do is just ask everyone, please, one more time, can we show our appreciation for you, Liz, for your time that you've made to be with us and share with such clarity this. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure, thank you.